my Irish, ancestors. So I go by Mickey, but yeah, legally it's Harold. So this is a university account, so it says Harold.
And yeah, some people can't change their names, but I think if I go to the right side of mine, I can rename myself. So just so you know that in the participants box, you guys generally have that option.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. I thought I did. Maybe it changed back. Anyway.
So Oscar, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Cara. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I'm Oscar. I'm from Australia. It's really early here, but I'm very happy to be part of this traffic safety presentation. Of course, being today moderating the discussion as well. So I'm, as I said, very honored to be here, and we will be hearing for a few studies. I think most of the people are already connected. So we will be talking, about injury severity, road safety values. There will be some discussion as well about autonomous and connected vehicles. And yeah, it looks a very exciting number of presentations. So I don't want to take a lot of time introducing, but I'm just going to repeat that the dynamic is, if you have any questions, please put in the chat box. I will be reading them and monitoring that, and I'll make sure that when the time is available, I will be answering the questions. Please try to make the questions clear and brief, or otherwise you will need to explain the question, and I will try to make that happen. So as Mikey, nice to meet you, and please, what I found is he's a visiting research specialist at the University of Illinois, and with expertise in health and economic outcomes of vehicle crashes. So Mikey, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Oscar, for that. And thanks, Kara, too, and for all the organizers. This is fantastic that we can do this all virtually. Let me see if I can share the right thing here. You're not seeing the PowerPoint, are you? Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. So. Okay, so I will start by saying that the presentations I've seen so far have been fantastic. Mine is less method and more heavily on the finding side, just given the people who funded the grants are more interested in the findings, less so than like the methods that I get to them. So this will be more heavily findings. So hopefully you guys are all into that. So yes, my name is Mickey Edwards. I'm a visiting research specialist at the University of Illinois, Springfield. And today we're talking about the effects of large vehicles, so like SUVs, pickup trucks, and vans, minivans, on pedestrian and pedal cyclist injury severity. I'd just like to start with this image here. This is actually, when I was looking through some of the data, this zip code in particular in Peoria, Illinois. All these data are based across Illinois. This particular zip code in Peoria kept popping up as particularly problematic. They kept having, pedestrians and cyclists would have particularly bad injuries and outcomes. And I don't know about the rest of you on the call, but if I get curious about a place, the first thing I'll do is go down to Street View and poke around a little bit. And what I found this right outside of within the zip code with a high problem area. This is right outside of a grocery store. And we see, in ways big and small, we see the transportation network infrastructure failing the members of this community. We see a handicapped individual here trying to make his way home from the store and taking his life into his hands to try to cross the street. So this could end in a very tragic outcome. So I like to start here as a grounding point to remind us all, myself in particular, of how important transportation infrastructure can be. So back to the topic at hand here. And share of large vehicles rise. So in the 1980s, around 1980, following a series of regulatory reform in auto safety, fatalities by motorists, so people in cars and passengers, and pedestrians and cyclists alike began to decline in a nice slow glide path, a decline, and that was nice. Then around 2009, there was a divergence where passengers and motorists either the fatalities rate among them stayed stable or continued to slight decline, but we saw pedestrians and cyclists fatality rate begin to jump. In fact, from 2010 to 2019, we saw about a 46% rise in fatality rate among pedestrians and cyclists. And this is coinciding with a takeover, if you will, of large vehicles and the production share. You see the bottom there's a graph of EPA data. This goes back to 75, and you see that the bottom turquoise color there is a passenger car. You see it begin, this erosion is pretty slow and steady across the 80s and 90s. But in 2009, you see it really begin to fade away pretty quickly, and it gave way to that red, particularly the red one there, and that is truck SUV. So this would be like a Chevrolet Suburban, which is based on the Chevrolet 1500 pickup truck. So we see traditional passenger car give way to SUVs, and especially truck SUVs, around the same time. So we thought we would look at this and see what we could find. So sources and methods. This project that I'm working on is the Motor Vehicle Data Linkage Project, and it was in the Center for State Policy and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Springfield. And really, it began as just this project funded from Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, to link Illinois is one of a few states who got the funding to link crash records from the Illinois Department of Transportation with hospital records from the Department of Public Health. So once we had all those linked, we're like, well, what else can we do with these things? So this is kind of like the study and many others like this that my team has created is like, well, what else can we do with this? But backing up to how we link these data. So we had to sign a data use agreement with IDOT for the crash data, and then an additional data use agreement with IDPH for those hospital data. And those data together are really useful because they have fields and points that are unique to that data set. So for example, for this particular study, the crash file has the type of what movements the driver made, what road conditions, whether speed was a factor, and the vehicle type. And the hospital data has things like race, ethnicity, home zip code. They have diagnoses of impairment. So we put those two together. If you could put those two together, it becomes a really useful data set. So again, the data linkage, it could go on about this all day. There's actually an entire conference about it next week in Denver, just focusing on data linkage. But again, this is very abbreviated. So the data linkage, we used what's called the Flegge-Sunter probabilistic matching method. They authored a paper and I believe a book about how to do this. So what it does is it imputes missing links between the data sets, and it addresses a whole variety of weak linkage variables. And to do this, we used a custom software called LinkSolve. There's several different software platforms out there. We used one called LinkSolve by a one-man company, Strategic Matching. Mike McGlincy was the guy who came up with the software. And there's just kind of at the bottom, the orange table is a brief summary of the linked records. So we see the CAB code, we'll get into the CAB code, the KABCO in I think the next slide, but that's an injury severity. So it shows the percentage, the successful percentage link, and these are actually quite good. So overall, we're able to link just south of 10% of all records, crash and hospital records together, which is pretty good when we compare that to what other states and other projects were able to do. So getting into some of the findings, and there's a bit of an eye chart there on the right. So CABCO, KBCO injury severity scale. The final bullet point here explains what that is. And what that is this is a injury severity rating that the police officer at the scene assigns to the injured in the crash. So K being fatal and A being incapacitating, B non-incapacitating, C is the victim says they have something, but there's nothing that the officer can see that's obvious, and O is no indication of injury. So this is a pretty good, but not perfect way to measure injury severity, because obviously police officers are not doctors, and they're not trained to give a good diagnosis. So we'll in the next slide, we'll explore what the hospital diagnosed. But here, looking at these, I have these kind of disaggregated by passenger car, pickup truck, SUV, and van and minivan. And they also have it by age. So under 18, we just call those children. 18 to 64 are adults, and 65 plus are seniors. So when we look at this, we see that children were 8 times more likely to be killed when they were struck by a SUV compared to the kids who were struck by a passenger car. So SUVs were involved in about 40% of childhood fatalities, but with a striking vehicle in just 17% of cases. So in just 17% of cases, the striking vehicle was an SUV, but way overrepresented in terms of fatalities. Almost 40% of childhood fatalities the SUV was the striking vehicle. So adults were about 4 times more likely to be killed when struck by a pickup truck compared to those struck by a passenger car. And seniors were 3 times more likely to be killed when struck by a pickup truck when compared to seniors struck by a passenger car. So pickup trucks, SUVs, and vans were about 44% of all the fatalities, but again, just 26% of all the crashes. So they were the striking vehicle in just 26% of crashes, but 44% of the fatalities. So it's a pretty significant overrepresentation in terms of very severe injury and fatalities. Here's our next injury severity scale that I alluded to previously. This is the MAIS, and this is the right here, the maximum abbreviated injury scale. This is what is given at the hospital by the medical professionals. So obviously, if you're a pedestrian or cyclist, you have probably have multiple injuries after being struck by especially a large vehicle. So this is the worst of those injuries from the maximum. So this is just kind of a rating of how severely injured one of the patients is. So a 1 is minor, 2 moderate, 3 serious, and so on. And this table shows the distribution of the moderate, so the 2 or worse on the MAIS scale, who sustained injuries to their head and thorax. The thorax is your chest, basically from your neck to your waist area. And the reason we studied that, the head is pretty obvious why you study that. With TMI, traumatic, or TBI, traumatic brain injury, and lifelong consequences those could have. Also, the thorax, there's a lot of important stuff going on in your chest. So sustaining an injury to your chest could also be very, very serious. So what this chart just shows is that relative to passenger cars, pickup trucks are overrepresented in severe injuries to head and the bodies of pedestrians and cyclists. And probably have people on the call who are familiar with why that may be, and that's probably just because the vehicle's taller, has more momentum. So instead of bouncing off the hood of a passenger car as you get struck in the body by one of these tall vehicles, and you're more likely knocked down to the ground, and also more likely to be run over as a result of that. We did do some logistic regression on this. So the responsive variable was binary on this, and it was 1 for fatality and 0 for not fatality. And we looked at lots of different things here. What happened up in the weekend, if it was in a rural area, if the driver was distracted, impaired, so their speed was a factor. Maybe there was a gender issue, maybe there was a racial or ethnicity difference. But really what came out was it was just the size of the vehicle. So we see there concentrating on the odds ratio here, the bold ones. Odds ratio above 1 increases the likelihood of the outcome being true. So in this case, it increases the chances of a fatality. Less than 1 decreases the chances of a fatal outcome. So we see for both a pickup truck, SUV, and vans, it significantly increases the potential for a deadly outcome. And interestingly, crash happening at an intersection was somewhat protective of pedestrians and cyclists. Maybe that's because maybe the car has slowed down or had time to react versus being out on an open road or cutting out from behind a parked car, something like that. Being a child also reduced the likelihood of being a fatal crash. Again, if you're a child, you're probably more resilient, you can heal a little bit more quickly or easily. Being a senior was associated with some of the highest effects of fatal crashes. An interesting thing, and I've never seen this in the research that I've done or the reviews that I've done. One of the cool things that we can do with these data is one of the fields in the hospital files is the hospital charges. So how much did this cost? How much will this patient charge? So when we look at this, we say, well, how much what does a passenger car cost versus a pickup truck when it's struck pedestrian or cyclists? And it is what you might expect. A passenger car We show the average and the median here. The passenger car had the lowest average and median hospital charges for pedestrians and cyclists, and the pickup trucks had the highest average charges for pedestrians and cyclists. I thought that was an interesting finding. So looking at race and ethnicity, though, outside of Chicago, this is in Illinois, the Black population is just about 10% of the total population, but they made up about 23% of the total pedestrian cyclist crash victims, so way overrepresented. Within Chicago, they were about at parity, about 29.6, about 31%. If you look at the Hispanic Latino population within Chicago, they make up about 29% of the total population, but just about 20% of the pedestrian and cyclist crash victims. So not quite sure why they're so underrepresented there. But outside of Chicago, they're again more at parity at about 14.4% of the total population and about 14% of the pedestrian cyclist crash victims.
1 minute.
Thank you. The famous line of researchers, more research is needed in this field. I think we've all seen the headlines, and it's true. There are roads becoming more and more deadly, especially for pedestrians and cyclists. So, a more nuanced study of the relationship between the rise in large vehicles and pedestrian cyclist injury will be very helpful. And also to better understand why the Black population is so overrepresented as struck pedestrians and cyclists. I'm an urban planner by training. So where are the communities most affected by this, and how can we invest in these communities to help out? There's been a slew of policy proposals, so reduce and actually enforce a posted speed limit. New York State has an idea to put a rating system on their Department of Transportation system to rate vehicles. The old-fashioned Pekuvian tax, so you could internalize those externalities. And then there's regulate the crash prevention and reduction technology and make that standard on all new cars going forward. I guess I'll wrap up there in time.
Thank you so much, Mikey. Look, I have a question for you, but we can go to that later. And if we have a little bit of time, I think it's better if we continue with the next presenter if it's available. I think Don Knipling, are you around? Don?
You're on mute.
You're right. Okay.
Cool. Yes. Just to introduce you, Don, Ron, I think you are a consultant and safety practitioner, as well as an author of the Long Haul. And I have to confess, when I was reading about your profile, I saw you have lots of experience. So really looking forward to hear about your thoughts about safety. And I really enjoyed reading about your paper on crash heterogeneity. It was very interesting when I had the chance. So please continue.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I've been around a long time, so this particular topic has mostly been a hobby for me, really. Nobody's paid me for most of it, and so I'm just doing it out of the badness of my heart, you might say. But anyway, let me pull up my presentation. Let's see. So I'm going to share screen. And here we go. I hope you can see this. Let's see. Okay, everything good?
Yes.
Okay, so the title is my name is pronounced Knipling with a silent K. So the presentation is H.W. Heinrich and the biggest fallacy in road safety research history. And so I want to recognize my co-authors, Steve Jackson and Anders off Wåhlberg. And we're going to start with a question. So the question is, what is the one best generalization about crashes and crash causation? And I'm going to say that it's that you can't generalize. You can't generalize because crashes are pervasively heterogeneous. That means generalizations from one source population to another are likely to be spurious. And this is especially true when the source events are not even crashes, or are minor crashes with no significant consequences. And so we call this the heterogeneity principle. And we think it should be a guiding tenet of crash analysis. And we think the opposite, that is of identical causal mechanisms across all these crash categories, is a big fallacy. Okay, so the topics of this presentation and my paper, the presentation is organized differently than the paper, but anyway, so we're going to talk about what is science. We're going to talk about the data sources we had, horizontal heterogeneity, vertical heterogeneity, and then talk about H.W. Heinrich and naturalistic driving. And then finally talk about SHARP2 a little bit and some crash and event anomalies in SHARP2. Okay, so what is science? So for this, I'm going to take you back to my childhood when John Locke wrote an essay concerning human understanding. And in that, he defined empirical science. And this was revolutionary at the time. Empirical science is understanding gained through systematic observation of external phenomena. So how does it work? So let's go back to freshman science. And so empirical science, the whole idea is to sample from a target population. So you have some target population of something out there that you want to understand. And that population is almost always heterogeneous in some way. So therefore you have a sampling method, and you collect a sample data set, and you analyze it. And the quality of your science is largely measured by the rigor of your sampling method. How well did you extract in a representative way your sample from your target population, and therefore does it represent the target population? Okay, so our data sources, what's new in this paper compared to other ones we've done over the past few years, is we've added data from the NHTSA's Crash Investigation Sampling System, or SIS. The past 4 years of data aggregated, and these are passenger vehicle towaways. And what's different about it is the injuries are classified per the medical abbreviated injury scale. So that's not CABCO. This is where they actually pull up, get the medical reports for the injuries, and then classify the severity of crashes accordingly. So we've also got some data from NIMBIX and large truck crash causation study, and a little bit at the end, we'll take a few shots at the SHARP2 system by looking at some data from that data collection. Okay, so horizontal heterogeneity. So in this figure and others, don't look at the trees, look at the forest, look at the big picture. And the big picture here is you've got, I just pulled up 4 different specific crash involvement types. 2 of them rear end, as you see in the middle. LVM is lead vehicle moving, LVS is lead vehicle stop. And then I've got 7 factors, 5 of which are critical reasons, and 2 are other factors, associated factors. And just look at the variety. So you see that each of these specific crash involvement types has a different pattern of involvement of these factors. And you see each of these factors are involved differently in these different crash types. So that's horizontal heterogeneity. As some of you know, I'm a big Clint Eastwood fan, so in honor of him, I've identified 3 major crash involvement categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, good. So good, from a standpoint of analysis, is when your driver vehicle was not at fault, was not assigned a critical reason. Bad is when they were at fault in a multi-vehicle crash. And ugly is when all by themselves, they got involved in a crash, and of course, were assigned the critical reason for causing that crash. Okay, so this is NIMBIX, and so there are the critical reason is really an important variable in these crash causation studies, most important variable in my opinion. And there are specific critical reasons and there are categories. So so here are some of the categories. There were actually a few more, but I'm just showing them some of the major ones. And so this actually doesn't apply to good, because the good involvement is one where you're not assigned a critical reason. But here's bad. So these are, again, these are drivers who were at fault, assigned a critical reason in multi-vehicle crashes. And just, you know, just look down those categories there. You see a lot of recognition failures and not so much of some of the others. And so look at that, and then look at ugly. So these are the same categories, but now you've taken your single vehicle involvements and classified the causes. And so you see some pretty big differences, right? The very first one, you know, non-performance, you know, bad versus ugly. Recognition failures, which dominate your multi-vehicle crashes, are, you know, fairly small, or at least medium, in single vehicle, and so forth. Speed is much greater. So I did the math on the entire chart here, and so what do you think that I've used a lot of correlations in this. So what do you think the correlation was? Was it a positive correlation between these two columns? Was it a zero correlation, or was it a negative correlation? Well, I bet most of you see, based on what the available data that I put in front of you, it's a negative correlation. Okay, bad versus ugly, it's a negative correlation here in NIMBIX, which means they're more dissimilar than similar. That, you know, single and multi-vehicle involvements are more dissimilar than similar in their causation. So think about that. Should you be mixing those two categories together? Is what's almost always done? Well, I think that's questionable. But we're going to go on, and so I did this for the large truck crash causation study also, the same comparison within the study, bad versus ugly, and you see they're both negative correlations. But here's a surprise, maybe. If you compare the studies within a category. Okay, so now within NIMBIX, within bad, within multi-vehicle at fault, NIMBIX versus LTCCS, you can see that's a pretty good positive correlation. And the same thing for ugly. So what that means is that, you know, in general, car crashes and truck crashes are more similar than different in terms of their causation, whereas single vehicle and multi-vehicle crashes are more different than they are similar. Okay, so vertical heterogeneity. So this is some of this new CIS data, and I'll mention NHTSA was very helpful to me on this. Okay, so this is what's called CAIS. So this is the most severe injury in the crash. Not just the most severe injury for a person. And what you see here is actually both vertical and horizontal heterogeneity. So you've got severity going up the chart, and you see a huge difference in drug involvement, shocking levels of drug involvement. But then you also see a big difference between single and multi-vehicle involvements, and that's horizontal. Okay, so alcohol. So alcohol is a kind of a similar pattern, a little different, but our main point here is just the pervasiveness of heterogeneity. Okay, and asleep at the wheel, same thing. There's a huge difference. So if you're studying, events from down here, if you're studying these minor piddling events, you get a completely wrong impression of these crash causes, because you're not capturing where the real problem exists.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Well, so crash harm is vertically skewed. So if you look at fatal injury and PDO crashes, and you look at the number of them, you look at economic loss, you look at societal loss, you see that 91% of crash harm exists in the fatal and injury crashes. So that's, in my opinion, where research should focus. All right, so I only have 2 minutes to talk about Heinrich. So Heinrich's most famous for his tenet assertion that the predominant causes of no injury accidents are identical with the predominant causes of major injuries. And this idea was the founding principle for the naturalistic driving mixed safety critical event methodology. That's where you collect all these mostly non-crash events, and you, based on the assumption that they're causally identical to crashes, therefore you extrapolate and you draw inferences for serious crashes. And so think about what this is. When you do this, it's not empirical science. Okay, you're not. Now I'm referring now to the non-crash, all the non-crash ones. We'll talk about crash ones in a bit. So that's not drawn from the target population. That's something where you yourself, the researcher, you've got certain numbers of hard braking, certain number of swerves, where you decide which ones of those you're going to include in your data set. You're the one who sets the threshold for it. And so you then throw together that data set and mix it up. And that's your mixed SCE data set. And that's a data set that, for example, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has been used to develop hours of service regulation. Okay, so I'm just not going to have time to talk about this. There was a study that claimed to validate this methodology, and when I went through it, I'm just going to have to scan through it, but the study claimed that it proved that the causal mechanisms for crash, there's no evidence that the crash causal mechanisms for crash and no crash are different, and that near crashes can be used as a crash surrogate. But my post-analysis of the same study, and I just don't have time to get into it, but here's the key one. This was conflict type. This is the data that was shown in the study. They didn't show percentages. They didn't show the correlation. And so if you look at that, and there was another variable like that, that contradicts the stated findings in the study. To me, this disproves the idea that these non-crashes are representative crashes. And these variables are how the crash happened, and the other one was how the crash started. Okay, so I'll just say one word on Sharp 2, a little bit more in the paper. So I was not involved in the Sharp 2 study, but I did have a typical Sharp 2 crash. And you see, I used my license plate as a sensor, and I detected an impact. And so this crash was sensor detected, but it was not severe enough to be police reportable and therefore to be recognized by society as something of importance. And indeed, in Sharp 2, 53% of all Sharp 2 crashes were minor, that is sensor detected, but not police reportable, ugly, i.e. single vehicle involvements. And that, in my opinion, and the data is in the report, very much distorts the Sharp 2 data set. You got two problems there. One is what I've just described about the non-crash part of it, the mixed SCE part of it. And then even the crash part of it has when you're detecting every little impact, it very much skews your data set compared to police reportable crashes, which after all represent some kind of societal standard for importance. Okay, I've probably used up the 2 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was very provocative, and I have to confess I did enjoy reading your presentation and the paper that you published as well. We better go to the next presenter, and if there is any questions, we probably can discuss at the end of the session, which is Norris.
Let's see. So how do I get out of this here?
Yeah.
Norris, I think you can take over regardless of whether he comes out.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, thank you, Norris. I just want to mention that you're a practitioner and a graduate research and teaching assistant at Cleveland State University. So welcome, and please the presentation.
Thank you. Yes, I am a graduate research assistant at Cleveland State University. Oh, sorry, I shared the wrong screen. I'll share the second screen in a minute. Yes, I am. My name is Norris Novat. I'm a graduate research assistant from Cleveland State University, where I'm currently doing my master's, taking my master's degree. So without further ado, I'll be presenting the study exploring the effects of traffic stops on road traffic crashes. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sure. So exploring the effect of traffic stops on road traffic crashes using a spatial-temporal analytical approach. And I would like to introduce my project members, which is my immediate associate professor and supervisor in this project, Dr. Emmanuel Kidando at Cleveland State University, and Dr. Angela Kitali at University of Washington, Tacoma, and Dr. Boniphace Kutela, who is with the Roadway Safety Program at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So I shall introduce the project and discuss the data, where it's from and descriptively wise, and then I shall present their methodology, results in discussion, and then I shall conclude and recommend from the study findings. So we all know the adverse impact of traffic crashes on various human socioeconomic aspects is impeccably greatest next to diseases and stuff like that. So various efforts have been done to actually reduce the number of crashes and the severity from these crashes by understanding the leading cause of traffic crashes and fatalities. Unfortunately, law enforcement has been one of them. Well, police play a great deal in minimizing unlawful driving and basically reckless driving that lead to crashes on the road and endanger human safety. So despite the known essence of law enforcement agency in using traffic stops to address public safety concerns, so very few studies, literature review indicates very few studies that have actually examined the relationship between proactive traffic stops and the occurrence of these traffic crashes occurring. So basically, the objective of this study is to do an in-depth spatial autocorrelation and spatial-temporal analysis. And within the setting of this project, Cincinnati, Ohio, So basically, we're trying to look how traffic stops and vehicle crashes vary spatially, but not only spatially, temporally, because maybe within the same area, but different time before and after COVID. So that's what we're trying to guess here. And the specific objectives being understanding the variation of traffic stops, understanding the impact of social demographic characteristics. We have other variables such as gender and income and stuff like that. And also we wanted to understand the impact of these social demographic characteristics on the spatial alignment of traffic stops and vehicle crashes occurrence. So this is Cincinnati neighborhood area, which is made up of 50 boundaries, and the data used, the traffic stops data used, is readily available from the Cincinnati Police Department website. And the study period was from 2015 to 2019. We had approximately 177,000 traffic stops that were used in the analysis after that data cleaning, and 890 traffic crashes that were used at data cleaning. Data cleaning included removing redundant data and missing data and stuff like that. So the methodology here, as I mentioned, a spatial autocorrelation analysis was used. And basically the measure of the performance metric here was the Moran's I index, which ranges from -1 to 1. So below 0, that will be a negative spatial autocorrelation between the feature variables, and 0 to 1 will be a positive spatial autocorrelation between feature variables. So in addition to that, we used the local Moran's I index, which basically narrows down to specific. We know there is a correlation between the feature variables that we're studying, but we will have to indicate the hotspot areas where exactly are these correlations indicated. So prior to that, we also used the Bayesian regression. We used two models, in fact, a basic Bayesian regression and a Bayesian hierarchical Bayesian regression model. So as we know, a Bayesian regression model is used to model count data, which for our case we're using count of traffic stops and count of traffic crashes, along with other variables, population, which are by nature count variables. So the basic Bayesian regression model had the random effect, which in this case is the variation, the spatial variation, the spatial weights of the neighborhoods. And the hierarchical regression model for this case includes the random effect parameter, which is the spatial weights of the neighborhood into the model. And then we did a model comparison, which is basically to kind of have the performance metrics to see which model performs better. We came up with a correlation coefficient, Pearson's correlation coefficients, and then we compare the mean absolute error and then the cumulative residues plots. So results and discussion. So here we have a spatial autocorrelation analysis results where we have the Moran's I value statistics, which is basically interpreted against a reference distribution under the null hypothesis of complete spatial randomness. That is, traffic stops are random events within Cincinnati areas or neighborhoods. So we see the Moran's I here is statistically significant clustering pattern of traffic stops and vehicle crashes from the plot here. As I mentioned, the Moran's I value ranges from -1 to 1. So a value from 0 to 1 would indicate a positive correlation. So there is a positive correlation between the feature variables. So we also have a density plot distribution of the Moran's I with the vertical blue line indicating the null hypothesis reference value, and the red value which indicates the observed Moran's I, which is 0.21, which is to the right of the reference value, so which indicates a positive correlation. We also see the clustering of the values around the regression line, which also indicates correlation. What we're trying to guess here is the spatial autocorrelation of these variables. So as I mentioned, although we can tell that there is a spatial correlation between the feature variables, but we also want to narrow down at specific hotspot sites where this correlation occurs. So here we have the local normalized value, which gives us the hotspot areas. So here we're observing the traffic stops. We see we have hotspot areas, which are neighborhoods which experience higher traffic stops. We also came up when we also have the distribution of the count of the traffic stops. So similarly, we also produce the same results for the vehicle crashes. So what we can get from here, we see a spatial alignment of these two variables, crashes and traffic stops. So the areas with the hotspot areas for traffic stops appear to be spatially aligning with this hotspot area of the vehicle crashes. So the results of the regression models, where after running the regression model, we had to do a comparative analysis to come up with the best model. So on the left, we have the basic Bayesian regression model with a Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.74. And to the right, we have a Bayesian hierarchical Poisson regression model with a Pearson value of 0.87. So in this case, the Bayesian hierarchical Poisson regression model with the inclusion of the random effect parameter, the spatial weights of the neighborhoods, it gives us a better correlation of the predicted crashes to the observed crashes. Okay, we also have the results of the cumulative residual plots, which well, the interpretation in this is the best model or the best Q plot model will have the observed residues oscillating about the zero line, the zero reference line. So 95% of the residues falling within the cumulative residual plot boundaries. For this case, we adopted the basic hierarchical Poisson regression for modeling the observed crashes against other explanatory variables, traffic stops, gender, their population, income, and socio-demographic characteristic variables. So here are the results of the adopted model, regression model, hierarchical Poisson regression model. So all the results were statistically significant at 95% high density interval, with the exception to when more than one vehicle was involved. As the previous presenter was telling us, there is a heterogeneity in the way in observing or trying to analyze or explain single vehicle crashes and multiple vehicle crashes. So that variable was statistically insignificant. So here we can see the positive correlation of traffic stop counts variable to the vehicle crash count variable, which basically suggests that vehicle crashes they are high where traffic stops are also high. So which this basically tells us the police or law enforcement exercise their action to areas with high traffic crashes or hotspot areas. We also see the posterior mean for the per capita income has a negative sign, which implies a negative correlation. So this indicates that areas with higher median income experience low fuel crashes, and likely they have fewer traffic stop counts. So that, well, to conclude, I'm not sure how much time I have to conclude this study. Used GIS spatial autocorrelation, the temporal analysis, and Bayesian hierarchical Poisson regression model to explain the relationship between vehicle crashes, traffic stops, and social demographic characteristics of Cincinnati or in Ohio. So vehicle crashes correlating factors were statistically significant at high density, 95% high density interval. Traffic stops and vehicle crashes occurrences across Cincinnati were especially heterogeneous, which we also observed the presence of road crash belts in Cincinnati, which are hotspots and cold spot areas with high vehicle crash occurrences and low vehicle crash occurrences. Similarly, areas with high exercise law enforcement and low exercise police stops or law enforcement. So reduction of traffic violation and risky driving using traffic enforcement may contribute to reduction in crashes. So yeah, potential contribution of this study will help policymakers, road safety agencies, other stakeholders to create spatially sensitive accident prevention measures. So it will help law enforcement agencies like know where to direct their forces for the purposes of minimizing roadway traffic crashes. So we would recommend further in-depth spatial-temporal analysis that would be helpful in the design of effective geographic accident prevention control initiative with respect to socio-demographic changes in time. Also, like I mentioned, designing and implementing appropriate countermeasures such as variable traffic speed limits, proactive law enforcement activities, but also creating safety awareness and education programs. So major limitation of this study is that for the 2020 data, which is the COVID-19 period, was omitted from the analysis because the observed crashes and there was a great decline of the observed crashes and the and traffic stops as well due to the lockdown in the neighborhoods. But also the finding of these factors affecting crash severities, they vary geographically. So the findings from Cincinnati neighborhoods do not necessarily shouldn't be necessarily replicated to the findings of other neighbors. They may they may vary heterogeneously. And that will be all. As we all know, vehicle crash is not an accident. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Norris. We do have for you, in your case, 5 minutes of questions. So if anyone has something to add, Cara has made a few comments about data sets and some econometric methods that you can apply probably later. I think if I can start then with a question, what I probably will ask you is, I would like to understand what type of areas have more traffic stops in the place where you were analyzing, and what can you tell me, for example, on the way the land is used in that area, and perhaps they can give us more insights of why the crashes seems to be higher in that particular. And I noticed that most of your suggestions were around behavior and police, but what about design of the cities and the way we live? What do you think about it?
That's a very, very good question, because obviously all the factors that you mentioned directly influence the traffic stops and the vehicle crashes. Unfortunately, the data that is published by the Cincinnati Police Department had a few variables and did not include the variables that you just mentioned, but the size, the income, other socio-demographically speaking, they are very influential variables. And I even see Kockelman proposed using audio data. Perhaps they have more data that could potentially influence the results of this model. But yeah, I agree with you. The other variables that you mentioned and possibly other participants are thinking the same thing. They would necessarily impact the findings of this research.
Yes, because to be honest, when I was thinking about it, I was like, well, we need less traffic stops, but at the same time, those traffic stops are needed as well, because it's the way potentially motorized traffic is interacting with pedestrians, vulnerable road users. So I think just for future research, it would be nice to look a little bit at how land is used and what it actually means for the community.
Right. Yes. Very right.
Please, anyone has any question?
Well, we can still see your screen, Norris, so you probably want to stop sharing as you navigate your folder system. But you will be presenting again, I think. And I raised my hand because I did want to mention to everybody that, he said traffic stops are necessary, and I guess they are right now, but I really think all of us should be allowed with any kind of phone or camera, including those little Nest cameras that people have on their front doorsteps, to alert authorities to really egregious behavior. And then you don't have to pay these cops a lot of money to try to see somebody and then pull them over or pull her over and talk to them and hope. So you can get a lot more information on bad actors really quickly if we allow a camera. And I think Canada and Great Britain and Australia, all part of the British Empire, do, but the US is still very, you know, don't tread on me, freedom or die kind of thing. So we're not allowing traffic-based enforcement generally, which is really unfortunate. But I do think our phone is the greatest weapon to combat really bad behavior. And I'd love to see one of you design an app that we can all use. And then it is, you know, we can't doctor it. It's real time. And a lot of people, as they drive, they have cameras, like a lot of taxi drivers and TNC drivers. They also use it in the vehicle to protect themselves from bad clients. And so I think it would be great. And you don't have to send out a $500 bill every time you catch somebody speeding or something. You just send out a warning, and then on the third you get $100 charge. And so you know, I think we'll see a lot better driving if they know eyes are watching.
And I think you're very much correct there. So was there a proposal I should continue?
I think we should probably go to our next presenter, which is almost time. So Kenneth Perrine is connected.
Yes.
Cool. Hello, Kenneth. Just to mention, I found that you're a research associate at the University of Texas at Austin. So please welcome and thanks for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Privileged to be here today. And I'm going to talk to you about our very interesting data-intensive research on looking at crashes at mid-blocks rather than the more traditional model of looking at crashes at intersections. And this is focused on the state of Texas, funded by Texas Department of Transportation. So you're all aware, I'm sure you're here very much hearing repeatedly that pedestrian crashes are an ongoing problem. And we're seeing that even though VMT rates are somewhat stable, we see our crash counts rising. Of course, our severe injuries. Mickey had a great presentation about some of the possible causes of that. But regardless, we know that it's a very important problem to continue researching. And we find that we have a little bit of a disproportionate pedestrian crash rate in Texas related to the United States. And we have also some recent striking numbers of how many pedestrian crashes we have. So we, in this research, are paying particular attention to mid-block crashes versus intersection crashes. And we find that just in some initial data analyses that we have a lot of disproportionate crashes between mid-blocks and intersections. And a lot of it really has to do with how we count. Intersections take up a finite space on a roadway, whereas mid-blocks are a lot further apart. But a lot of this research also has to do with finding what are some of the reasons or causes of that. Why would the severity be worse in mid-blocks than intersections? And we find too that Austin is a great study area because it accounts for 5% of Texas's total pedestrian crashes. Austin is, as far as I know, the 4th largest city in Texas. No, 5th largest city in Texas. So the data sets that we've used for this research include the CRIS data set, which it's Texas Department of Transportation's repository for crash records that have been logged by police officers. And that's not to say that it includes all the crashes or all the incidents, but it's the best that we have. And we have over 5.6 million police recorded crashes in a 10-year time period that we analyzed for this. And we have a proportion of that that's pedestrian-related deaths. And we also have inside that data set, crash type, severity, location, a lot of the typical variables. But that was one interesting thing about Mickey's research, was that I think we could stand to have a lot more if we could combine our data set with some other sources that could correlate hospital data sets. And that's an area for future research. We also have a roadway inventory, link design, average traffic counts, various design attributes that can be either seen from fields in the data set or fields or analysis of the actual geometry. It's a GIS data set. And also some land use variables that are very insightful to help us understand what are some disparities, external factors that could be impacting crashes and crash counts in various parts of cities and counties. We also have environmental factors. One interesting data set that we came up with was a walk miles traveled. We inferred that from a couple different data sources that I wasn't quite involved with that research, but perhaps if there's any questions about it, we can provide more insight about. The text.roadway inventory is a massive GIS file, has all the roadways, over 800,000 segments, representing over 330,000 miles of geometry, and lots of information about roads, including the number of lanes and certain types of geometry factors. Okay, now let's get to what we do about predicting crash counts based on intersections and also mid-blocks. We find initially with some of our scan the data that the mid-block severities are worse than those of intersections. And we find too that there is a difference between what we find within the city of Austin versus the rest of Texas. Within this, most of the crash studies were segment-based and didn't distinguish intersections, and traditional studies didn't differentiate between intersections and mid-blocks. So that's the reason why we had to do the work to differentiate that. So first, to differentiate it, inside that roadway geometry, there is no such thing as an intersection. We have geometry that crisscrosses, but that doesn't preclude bridges from crisscrossing or nearby roadways from crisscrossing. So we had to go deep to try to figure out how to positively identify where are intersections in relation to the roadway inventory. So first of all, we used nearest neighbor. It failed miserably because we had lots of places roads cross over each other. So we used OpenStreetMap, a crowdsourced data set that is actually very reliable as far as geometry, being able to tell us where intersections are. And we used that extracting node link architecture and then doing some searching within the roadway inventory to figure out where are the intersections. We had to use some rules to figure out where intersections should go. So if we had two roadways that abut like this, we didn't want to put an intersection there because it doesn't really represent an intersection. So here we can see two depictions. The top one here being the roadway inventory, which looks like this within the GIS software, and then OpenStreetMap, which will have intersection data. It even says where traffic signals are, and then be able to identify where they are within the roadway inventory. Now, there are some interesting nuances where we have further details inside OpenStreetMap than we have inside text.roadway inventory, including places where this little roadway diverges. Here, it just is a single link that abuts this frontage road. So of course, since we're using OpenStreetMap to figure out where intersections are, we get two intersections there. But these are relatively far and few between, and we didn't really let that stop us from our research. We also needed to process the roadway inventory to get uniform segment lengths so that when we talked about corresponding a segment to numbers of crashes to come up with sense of density and so forth per segment, we wanted to hover roughly around a 1 mile length segment, not the segments that already exist in that data source. That data source actually has extremely short segments, which could be as little as 5 feet, to extremely long, which could be as long as 44 miles. So we had to resample it using an interesting approach for trying to hover around 1 mile segments and then have the slack be picked up by the endpoints on the original segments. With that, here's an example of using downtown Austin with our methodology to positively identify the intersections and also the places that are in between the intersections. And with that, we have 700,000 intersections throughout Texas, and then 575,000 mid-block segments that are roughly about a mile long. Now we get to our crash count prediction. We studied the crash data set provided by Texas Department of Transportation using negative binomial distribution, 10 years worth of data, pedestrian crashes, and we looked at the whole entire state and also within the city of Austin. And we're looking for the most practically significant factors. And here's our results. If you look at these graphs, you can see the various variables that we used. And these bars represent the changes in the number of pedestrian crashes if we reduce or change these relative variables or change these variables by 1 standard deviation. So you can see with this walk mile traveled, which is a sense of walkability within a region, if we vary walkability, walk miles traveled within the region by 1 standard deviation, our number of pedestrian crashes increases dramatically, significantly. So some key results from all this is that the number of pedestrian crash counts doubles when walk miles traveled is changed, and also signalized intersections is also a strong indicator of a higher crash count. And also transit stops are a good predictor of crash count increases. Nearby a transit stop will have a 43% increase in pedestrian crashes. The number of approaches to an intersection will increase the number of pedestrian crashes. We also find too that pedestrian crashes fall when we have one-way streets, wider medians, and I'm not too sure what the significance is, but a longer distance to the nearest hospital. We found that within the city of Austin, the same kind of intersection will incur more crashes, a higher crash count than intersections in the rest of the state. One cause could be possibly because of homeless population. And of course, that I think is a very worthwhile area of research and something that we definitely do want to look at in the future, because we did see hints of that as possibilities. Now,
5 minutes.
Thank you. I think we'll be able to be within range here. So with the Texas mid-blocks, we have some similar results. Walk miles travel is going to be a predictor for a dramatic increase in number of crashes. We also see similar situation with a number of transit stops. But we see with mid-blocks, a one-way street will actually incur a more dramatic reduction of crash counts. And we find that in mid-blocks, City of Austin actually incurs fewer mid-block crashes than other places in the state. Now, looking at just Austin, we look at intersections versus mid-blocks, and we find that signalized intersections are, again, a place where there's a higher likelihood of intersection-related crash counts. But interestingly here, Central Business District, if we're inside the Central Business District, it's going to be dramatically higher number of pedestrian crashes than if we're outside the Central Business District. Another interesting thing that we found is that in places where the average household income is higher, like if we're higher $41,000, the number of pedestrian crashes drops by 32%. Interesting equity concern. And that's something that I think is worthwhile looking at further as well. If we look at mid-blocks, we have some similar looking phenomenon, except that here, if we're inside the Central Business District, our mid-block crashes are going to increase dramatically. We also have that same equity concern about mid-blocks. So in summary, signalized intersections in central business district are relative hotspots for pedestrian crashes. We find that mid-block segments have more vulnerable crashes or more crash severity than at intersections. And we know that walk mile traveled and vehicle miles traveled are good indicators for increased pedestrian crashes. That's a given, but yet it's interesting to know how much, and helps us to figure out where we need to really focus our research efforts. We find that Austin's mid-block crashes rose faster due to central business district indicator, more than intersection counts. And we also find too within this some hints of data ambiguity where we would be very good to look at more opportunities for data linkages to other data sources, including being able to look at crash direction, the exact location of the crash, because GPS locations are somewhat sparse within that crash data set, and looking at some of the details about some of the crash narratives, such as why the crash has happened, whether there's excessive speeding, other types of design attributes of roadways. And we need to be able to add those to the data that we're analyzing within the same methodology. So with that, I encourage you all to be safe out there and invite any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I don't think we have any questions, but I think I want to ask you something. You mentioned at the beginning, which I didn't know, that there is a large proportion of pedestrian crashes in Texas compared to Texas Austin, compared to other cities in Texas. And I have the chance to visit Texas many years ago when I was younger. And I remember the CBD is amazing. It has a lot of nightclubs, very vibrant, and lots of fun people. Would you say that the fact that the city is so nice for pedestrians and to spend time in it and for walking is one of the reasons, and that perhaps pedestrians are, the policies in the state perhaps are not necessarily what a city like Austin needs, which there is so many students and there is so many activities that people can do outdoors. And also was wondering about the equity aspect that you mentioned regarding income. This means that perhaps people with more income, they drive more and there is less pedestrian activity. But at the same time, what do you think will have in case, for example, sustainability? Is it sustainable to have people not driving so much anymore in these days where that's a concern?
Yes, thanks, Oscar. I'll address your second question first. And I do believe that there, and I would like to, I remember seeing some stats earlier, but I don't remember exactly. And Dr. Kockelman, if you're available, please chime in. But I do think that drivability is going to be correlated with increase in household median income. I know, for example, in Austin, those neighborhoods that are higher income are not as much served by public transit. And also, I don't see as many people walking around, especially for getting to school or going to work. They're driving. So I think that's definitely true. I would think further study about the infrastructure quality would be very important, just to see if there's an equity disparity of infrastructure in those areas that might have a lower household income. The other question about whether walkability attracts more pedestrian incidents, I think there is some truth to that. In fact, in this same project, we did a very in-depth study of some of the worst crash-prone locations in Texas. And we actually published a data set. If you're interested, please chime in on the text and I'll get you information on where to look. But we do have a data set out there about the top 100 worst corridors, crash-prone corridors for pedestrians in Texas. And a lot of those are around places where there's a lot of pedestrians walking late at night, places where there's just a lot of late activity or a lot of tourists, a lot of visitors that happen to be going to bars or clubs around universities. So there definitely is a correlation there. And I think areas that cities should prioritize for certain types of crash mitigations.
Yes, and it makes me think as well that when we want to promote walkability, and this is very relevant for Australia, for instance, that is a very car-centric country that is very interested now in increasing active travel, we also need policies that restrict motorized transport and in a way that protect pedestrians. We cannot have the two things, basically. And I think Texas is a fantastic case study, especially because I know Austin and I know how walkable it is and how beautiful city. There was some comments here. We still have a little bit of time. Mike say the research showing impairment among pedestrians and cyclists is also a factor, which is I agree. I think what do you think about it? Do you think that perhaps alcohol impaired walking is a problem or things like that?
Oh, definitely, yes. And there's also a concern too, back to the homeless population, which I really do believe is, I think, the next area to study. Homeless status is something that has not been reliably logged within the crash data set that we used. And I know that City of Austin has started having their own set of data that does record whether the particular person that was involved in a severe crash was homeless or not. And I think with that comes a number of factors that there would be a disparity against other types of population. But I think also, especially in the areas where there's notably a lot more intoxication or substance abuse, there definitely will be a significant change in the number of pedestrian incidents.
That's cool. By the way, any thoughts about your hospital distance finding? What happened in the hospitals in Texas?
Yeah, good question. I think perhaps there might be a correlation between the idea that the hospitals are generally in places where there's a lot of population concentration and walkability. I can't really think of any hospitals, even in Austin, that are in the suburbs or in places that are not very walkable. That's my guess, though. I think we need to collect better data to find for sure.
Ooh, any more questions for Kenneth? I think the next presenter is not going to be available, Tara, right? Thank you so much, Kenneth. I think Hannah is not going to join us, so we can ask questions to all the presenters in this 20 minutes that we have, I think. So please grab your questions in the chat box. Otherwise, I want to first talk about Mike's presentation. If you are available, I really enjoy seeing some research on data linkage, which is something that in Australia, although we have really good data sets, we still cannot do correctly. And I was very curious because you mentioned that you match around a little bit less than 10% of crashes. And in terms of equity, this is just a question that I have. I know that the linkage is very complicated, but do you think that policymakers, for example, can make decisions based on such a small number of cases and that will impact a lot of people, for instance? So what do you think about it?
Yeah, those are great questions. And, before I started the data linkage work, I had no idea that there's an entire industry of data linkage of really smart, thoughtful people who are really trying to make a good difference of trying to figure out how we can combine these data sets. And frankly, it's a lot tougher than it should be, I think. Yeah, you're right, 10%, and there's a lot of factors for that. In Illinois, again, we start with over 1.2 million hospital records annually, and those are for everything. That's for falling in the shower or whatever. So yeah, you're gonna, a lot of those are just not related to car crashes at all. So that's why you get kind of a lower linkage rate. And also, not everyone who's in a crash show up at the hospital to get or need to be transported to the hospital to receive treatment. So that's another factor for it. A third factor is strictly administrative. So maybe they wrote the name down wrong, got the wrong birth date in one of the files. So when that happens, there's different parameters that we use, the software uses to, like I said, impute those, so those can be controlled for, but not in every case. But again, that south of 10% is pretty good for the industry standard in terms of how successful the linkage can be. Is a little bit high, and I think it's a little bit high because we use the LinkSolve software that does use the imputation process. So the question of the equity is an interesting question, and I was just emailing Kara about this, Kara Kockelman, which I try to control for that in some of the other studies that we do. And because we have these two data sets, we can do some really interesting things. So what we can do is, in the hospital codes, there's this thing called E-codes. And what it is that's like the billing code that the hospital technicians put into the file, and it just describes what injuries there were and how the injuries were sustained. So we can use, we can write a code or a software program that extracts all of the injuries in the hospital file that were coded as a pedestrian or cyclist struck by motor vehicle, whatever those would be. And then we can isolate those cases that we fail to link with the police report. So when we do that, we find that, those cases where we have people showing up at the hospital who were struck by a car on foot or on bike, they're not randomly distributed across Illinois. They're disproportionately in zip codes, and we have the patient zip code in the hospital file, and we have the patient race. So it's not like we're guessing what the race and this ethnicity or an age are. We have those data. So in this disproportionately, low income neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, and people who have high rates of carlessness. I mean, that's another factor is, and those are the big ones: high rates of carlessness, high rates of racial and ethnic minorities, and poverty. So I'm actually, one of the projects I'm working on, and one of the things that I promised the IDOT that I would work on, is try to work on like a weighted average. So there's just like in different government reports, like ILBR, or is it the Bureau of, maybe it's BLR, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So they did seasonally weight all the averages and things. So I want to start getting to a point where, at least in Illinois, we can report these numbers and say, well, here's what we think was actually happened, because we have all these other files that probably didn't report them. So we can just kind of average or weight that number and have a more accurate representation of the true cost. And look, this neighborhood that you think isn't doing so bad, there's a lot of crashes happening in this neighborhood. They're just not reporting it to police. And I don't know, we don't know exactly why that is. I think another element of this is we could potentially in the future do some surveys. This all lies in the future research thing, right? We could survey some of these neighborhoods and say, anyone who was struck and did not report it to police, and if so, why not? Is it I don't trust police? Is it you were impaired and you were afraid to contact police? Is it you don't have health insurance? Whatever it may be. So those are raised some interesting questions there, and those are very insightful. So we are doing things to try to address those issues.
Yeah, and I love that comment that you talk about people not reporting incidents, because that's also a problem in Australia. We have a universal healthcare, and there is a national insurance scheme as well. So there are no issues on people not having access to services, but mistrust to police, for instance, is very high in indigenous communities. They don't report anything. And so, it's a combination of factors, and definitely that's important. I think from your data, there was something that really caught my attention, which was about the children and how they were associated with less severity in, they are resilient, but they're also very vulnerable in terms of impact and crashes. And I wonder if it's exposure, if people that are crashing, and particularly those truck vehicles, there are no children in those vehicles and the pickup trucks. What do you say about it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me revisit the last comment real quickly, because again, these data are statewide. So this isn't just like a big city problem either. This is in terms of not calling police. Illinois is, if you're familiar with their geography, Illinois, much like Texas, is a very big state, and they're very dense urban areas, and they're also very spacious agrarian areas. So if I'm in the country and I get struck by a vehicle, or maybe it's a farm vehicle, I know that it may take an hour or so for the ambulance to show up. So I'm just going to have my family or someone take me anyway. So it's not just, it is a very diverse issue. There's lots going on. So it's not just a singular issue in a certain neighborhood in a certain city. It's all across the state. So it was also emailed Kara the same. These are all very good questions. Emailed Kara as well. So the data that I present are likely a little bit skewed toward the more severe injuries, since because those are the ones that I'll be able to link, because those are the crash victims who go to the hospital and seek treatment. So if you're able to look at all the data, you're probably fine. Like the number I have in there is children who were struck by an SUV were about 8 times more likely to be killed versus those struck by passenger car. And again, those are just the more, actually, those data are actually just using crash data. So those, I correct myself, those are actually just the crash data, and that is independent of the hospital data. And the interesting thing about those data is at IDOT, there's a team who monitors and follows up with crash victims. So if there's a severely injured crash victim who passes, weeks or a month later, they will actually go back into the file and correct the CABCO injury scale to a K to follow up with that. So that's one of the reasons why I used that to model our logistic regression. It's in Illinois is considered like the gold standard of fatality record. But in terms of the children, I've thought about that. I've considered that, families used to drive like station wagons and minivans, and they still do to an extent. But at least where I am, families are kind of, as everyone else is, going to SUVs. So maybe it is a case where children are around SUVs more frequently than they are a passenger car, because they're family and they're, or they're in school or whatever it may be. That's a tough question in terms of their exposure, because in that case, I looked at that briefly to see if there was a difference in exposure between like an adult or a senior in a minivan. And there really wasn't with the minivan, and there really was a slight difference with the SUV, but nothing really to me to indicate their exposure to a certain type of vehicle. But yeah, I mean, they are more resilient. And it's interesting, like the different types of vehicles, like for some reason, the SUVs were particularly deadly for children, and the pickup trucks were particularly deadly for seniors. So I don't know why that is. I haven't been able to suss that out yet, but that's another interesting question.
Thank you very much. Look, I think those exciting things of data linkage projects that you can go very in-depth in data, and it was very interesting. I think I'm gonna ask also a question to Ron, if Ron, you're around. I really enjoy your presentation, mostly because I work a lot on this type of analysis. I'm a human factors person, and I use the IANS data, but also in Australia, there has been this explosion of people doing machine learning and learning from near misses and going to crashes, but I found your arguments really compelling on why it's important to think a little bit more what a minor incident means. And from a behavioral perspective, and this is my question now, I also think that some type of situations that we consider minor crashes, humans and human drivers have the possibility to recover themselves, because I study resilience and capability of drivers, and I'm very interested in how they prevent a situation that can be considered safety critical, and they can take action to reduce the severity in some ways, and some situations are easier than others. So yeah, what do you think about the human factors and how that can be related to your data? And also, what can we learn from looking at those minor situations? Why is important from a safety perspective? What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing I would point out about so-called near misses and non-crashes in general, these are almost always successful events. That the driver has braked or swerved or done something to avoid the crash. Whereas if you look at actual crashes, many of them, the drivers never make any avoidance maneuver whatsoever. And so, one of the criticisms is that, non-crash SCEs are successes, whereas, crashes are failures, or in many cases, failures to even respond. Actually, let me give you an example of what I consider to be valid use of non-crashes. And that is where you don't mix them. The problem is where you take these, disparate types of events, they're, rear end, they're, road departure, they're, crossing path, they're swerves, they're, you name it, and just mix them together on the assumption that you can generalize that to crashes in general. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's a very nice study that was done by Susie Lee and others back in 2007 with the 100-car study, where they just looked at rear end crashes. And there they analyzed rear end crashes. They found very nicely that in the vast majority of rear end crashes that it's not a question of reaction time. It's a question of attentional lapses. Okay, so if everybody paid attention, you'd prevent most of the rear end crashes. You might have some where you're in a big line of traffic and everybody slams on the brakes and you just can't react fast enough. But what that study did, importantly, was show just looking at rear end crashes, and its conclusions were just related to rear end crash. You could perhaps generalize that to other crash types, but they stuck to their lane. Whereas this idea of just mixing everything together and making these these grand extrapolations to that, that's what's completely wrong in my view.
So your recommendation for everyone trying to analyze these big data sets of naturalistic driven studies is to look at minor incidents to real incidents like crashes with an dangerous outcome independently, and learn from the minor ones to see what is successful from it, and trying to replicate that. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I think we need a lot more focus on severe events, and I realize it's a numbers game. So something like Sharp-2, it has a very small number of severe events, and that was actually towards the end of my presentation. I didn't get to, but I think it's quite a small number, but nevertheless it has some. And so if you restrain yourself and don't try to overgeneralize, over extrapolate, if you use data on severe events to try to address serious crashes, and you could even do some kind of parametric things where you could make some predictions perhaps on okay, let's take your that data on drug involvement, where you have beautiful curve there as to the amount of drug involvement in those more serious events. So if you had a data set of some sort and you had your severity, you could say, well, we have this CIS data, national data relating to all levels of severity. My data is just more minor events, but if I model it, if I extrapolate my data, mindful of the fact that it'd be like indexing. You could index your if you know that it's not representative, then you could index your extrapolations in a way that is more realistic. And these these natural driving studies never talk about this. They never, the word representativeness, validity, you're just not going to find those words in these reports. So if they did, then they maybe would address it. Maybe they would take the time to say, okay, what can we do to make this, more valid and representative of serious crashes? And that's where the harm is.
Yeah, and I think that's a good recommendation for everyone that is reviewing these papers and thinking about this research. I just have just a little comment, a final one, before we go to the next presenter, which is in Australia, we don't have a lot of severe crashes. We do have a naturalistic driving study, funny story, because there were no crashes in it. And the same happened in Europe and in other of the studies that they have a small number. It was like 2 or 3. Basically, they just could do qualitative analysis of them. So the definition of severe, for example, and for us is we want to prevent, as everyone should, we think that all injuries are preventable. So something very severe for us is an injury. What would you say about it? Because what worries me is that also by giving so much focus on those high range incidents, we can be forgetting about the low range ones that have important costs for society. A minor crash in some people can result in whiplash, chronic pain, and a lot of health issues on board. And so how can we negotiate that focus on the high level without missing the point that the low range also have a cost for society, for instance,
Well, again, I think there's the data on societal cost and harm. I think those are basically valid data that I showed. It's official data from NHTSA for what it's worth. I think there's, in general, I think we've been so dazzled by technology that if we're not filming something and get an instant replay, then we don't think it has value. But I think there's huge amount of value in just crash analysis and investigations. I think the studies and NIMBIX and LTCCS are highly valid studies in spite of the limitations of post-crash investigations. But from the start that you're looking at the problem. You're not looking at something else. You're looking at a dead body and figuring out what happened. And so I know it's completely out of style, but I'd like to see a lot more just regular crash analysis.
Thank you.
I'd never used this SIS database, and it's not a crash causation database, but nevertheless, there's a lot of information in there.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Ron and Mike as well for keeping up with my questions. And I think it's time for us to go to the next presenter, which is again Norris. Are you around? By the way,
yes.
Fantastic discussion, everyone. Thank you so much. Please, Norris. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can you all see my screen? Sorry.
Yes.
Great. Yes, once again, my name is Norris Novat. I'm a student at Cleveland State University, but I'm also a graduate research assistant. So in this study, which I authored with the same authors that I presented before, Dr. Emmanuel Kidando, Dr. Angela Kitali, and Boniphace Kutela from the Cleveland State University, University of Washington, Tacoma, and Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So here we are looking at a comparative study of types of collision between automated and conventional vehicles using Bayesian probabilistic inferences. So we all know automated vehicle technology is a promising technology for improving the efficiency of traffic operations and most importantly, safety, among other things. Moreover, will simply does so by minimizing or eradicating human errors. So human errors such as distracted driving, driving under influence, and all scenarios that endanger human life on the road. So with the introduction of automated vehicle technology, we suppose we're going to eradicate such kind of safety riskiness. So our literature review discovered that there are studies that done on AV safety. However, few studies have actually used available crash data, and this is simply because there are few automated vehicles on the road right now, and most of them are still within allowed roads or allowed established road test beds, and so there is limited crash data to actually analyze. So majority of the safety studies involving automated vehicles is done from simulation point of view. There are, however, safety studies that have actually used published automated vehicle data, particularly from the California Department of Motor Vehicle Bureau. However, these studies haven't tackled their problems from a comparative analysis point of view on how well do automated vehicles perform against conventional vehicles. So we developed a Bayesian network model using Monte Carlo Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation, and came up with probabilistic inferences and to compare the two scenarios. So the data used from this research was obtained from California DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles. That is AV data. It's freely available data, and the data, crash data by the conventional vehicles, which is human drivers, was obtained from transportation injury mapping system, an extensive database that has a crash data set. So like I mentioned, the CMC California DMV is an open repository, and in 2004, vendors such as Ford Motor Vehicles that are actually manufacturing automated vehicles were required to actually report any crash to the CADMV, which are basically PDF reports. So you have to gather the reports and kind of extract the crash data, the necessary parameters that you need. So we had 127 reported AV automated vehicle crashes and 865 conventional crashes. As you can see, 127, and right now there might be more reported crashes. 127 is a relatively few data set. So this is one of the, I think, early studies that actually used actual automated vehicle data on the road, with very few observations there. So the first step after getting the data was to merge the data to have an effective comparison. We established a 50-feet buffer around each automated vehicle crash, and the reason to do this is we wanted to gesture more similar characteristics around each vehicle crashes for actually doing accurate comparison of vehicle crashes characteristics, it being geometric characteristics, crash characteristics. However, this assumption is also limited in terms of time, because vehicle crashes, although they occurred at the same place, if they occurred at the same place and different time, the vicinity features might have changed. That's one limitation of the study that we listed down. So descriptively speaking, here is the distribution of the various variables that we incorporated in the model. Basically, we had collision type into 3 categories: rear end, side swipe, and all other variables, or other types of collision: head-on, overturning, hitting fixed objects, were combined into the others category. We also had road classification, segment type, number of lanes, lane usage, and speed limit variables. So quickly on the methodology, the Bayesian network, we basically used such algorithm called greedy hill climbing algorithm with this penalizing function called the archaic information criterion. So the idea here is to get the optimal network that will give us the best probabilistic inferences from the Bayesian network. So we had two kind of probabilistic inferences. We had individual evidence and combined evidence. And basically from the individual evidence, we have the posterior output or probability distribution, which is the type of collision. Let's say it's a rear end collision with one evidence. For this case, let's say, what is the probability of rear end collision occurring when the vehicle is automated vehicle or when the vehicle is conventional vehicle. And the second type of probabilistic inferencing that we did was having combined evidence. And for this case, the posterior probability being let's say it's a rear end and it being an automated vehicle, what is the likelihood for, let's say, a rear end crash occurring given it's an automated vehicle, but at the same time at an intersection or a roadway segment, or if when we have different land use at different speed limits. So we kind of have another set of observation or a conditional variable. So this was the optimized Bayesian model structure. Basically, we have parent nodes and the child nodes, all explaining the output of the response variable, which is 3 categories of the collision type. So we had 4 variables: speed limit, number of lane, segment type of vehicle type that were actually directly connected to the collision type. Does not mean that land use and road classification had no immediate impact to the output variable, but these variables in terms of the Bayesian networks are called the hypothesis variables that were found, given the data, were found to be highly influencing a certain type of collision. So from the individual evidence prediction, what we're having for this case, figure on the left A, we're observing, we had our evidence automated vehicle, well, we defined it as 1. So what is the probability for the rear end type of collision occurring, swipe, and other type of collision? So we can see automated vehicles are found to have a high likelihood of occurrence compared to conventional vehicles, with a difference of almost 44%. However, automated vehicles have a low likelihood of being engaged in a swipe collision and other type of collision in comparison to the conventional vehicles. So we also did some kind of disregard this error here. It's not a spatial autocorrelation analysis. Here we were trying to do a Bayesian hypothesis testing of probability distribution to see if to see the accuracy of the inferences that are produced. So the Bayesian hypothesis testing here, the null hypothesis is that the probabilistic inferences are the same, and the alternative hypothesis, they are actually different. So we see none of these average posterior distribution are actually 0. They're all not 0, and they are all significant at 95% high density interval. So we had combined evidence prediction inferences, meaning that for a certain vehicle, let's say automated vehicle or a conventional vehicle, we also set a condition, it being at an intersection or at a segment or given number of lanes and speed limits, and observe and discuss the probabilistic inferences. So it's a lot of observation and a lot of variables. So I just marked out a few results to just discuss and present here for the sake of time. So from the table, basically we see the probability change between conventional vehicles and automated
5
vehicles.
minutes.
and automated vehicles for rear end collision are negative 0.42 for signalized and signalized intersection. So we can say that rear end collision are more common at an intersection than a segment for automated vehicles. And so for another valid variable, let's say when the number of lanes was 1, we see AVs are more likely to be involved in rear end collision than conventional vehicles. One may say a reason may be limited room for maneuverability on a one-lane corridor. So we also see AVs less likely to be engaged in a side-swipe collision in one-lane corridor. Similarly, for 2 or more lane corridors, we see AVs are still likely to be involved in rear-end collision compared to conventional vehicles. AVs are also less likely to be involved in side-swipe type of crashes compared to conventional vehicles. So there's plenty of discussion from this table, from the paper submitted. So we also have a speed limit lower than 45 miles per hour. We also infer that the likelihood for rear-end collision being higher, which is still higher for AVs compared to vehicle crashes. Similarly, for side-swipe collision, you see AVs having lower chances of being involved in side-swipe type of collision. So we see automated vehicle crashes are generally performing better in all kinds of collisions, with exceptions to the rear end kind of collision. So this is what the available data that is published is telling us. So to conclude, obviously, automated vehicles technology has the potential to actually improve safety and minimize current crashes on the road. So by minimizing, of course, the lacking human behavior. So the inferences that we're drawing based on the inference that we're drawing from the optimal Bayesian network model. Generally, AVs are more 43% more likely to be involved in rear-end crashes, while being 60% and 27% less likely to be involved in side swipe or other type of collision. So this is kind of like the highlight of this paper in general, the main finding of this paper. So we also identify the hypothesis variables, the variables that were used to come up with the inferences, or that had were more influential to the occurrence of a certain type of collision. So in a general comment here being, although the AVs are expected to improve safety, we still see a limitation in rear end. So potential improvement may be required by manufacturers or people engaged in transportation, policymaking, and stuff like that. So these findings will be helpful to road engineers, road safety professionals, relevant authorities in improving the state of the current technology, but also in the policy development. Yes, and the limitation of the study, like I mentioned before, we used the 50-feet buffer zone to kind of narrow down to the crashes that occurred at the same area. However, it's limited in terms of time. But the other limitation that will be few observed crashes. So with more crash observation, we anticipate better findings from such kind of a study. And that will be the conclusion of my study. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Norris. I was very interested to see, this analysis but at the same time, what do you think about all these issues that these autonomous vehicles have? Because they allow drivers to be more free of demands, and that will explain, your finding on rear end crashes. I mean, I'm a bit worried of mentioning that they're going to improve safety, as you highlighted in your conclusion, when they're still creating new issues. Perhaps they will fix all issues, but there will be new things happening. Like, for example, rear-end crashes, it could be because of distraction and attention, which we know is very prevalent in this type of situation. So what is your study telling us about the importance of the human factors and behavior aspects?
Very good question, Oscar. So one would say the current state of technology is definitely still lacking, and it will be improved as time goes on. But the current state of technology will forever depend. I mean, the automated vehicles themselves will forever depend with the how best the infrastructure is. I mean, in terms, because they work best with communicating with roadside units and other kinds of devices that they can share data with, detect for, effective detection of an object or a threat that is to improve safety. So infrastructure-wise, it's still a milestone to approve for these automated vehicles to actually operate at a capacity they're expected to operate. That is one, but also in terms of harmonious adaptation, the operation of automated vehicles with conventional drivers on the road, like you mentioned. So autonomous vehicles detects an object or unsafe scenario, it slows down or stops at an intersection. But a driver who in his mind, it's the signal is turning yellow. In his mind, he wants to pass through the intersection or passing a red light, so it ends up in a rear end crash and situations like that. So I would say it would take time to effectively accommodate the harmonious operation of automated vehicles and conventional human drive. So it's a question of time, but still manufacturers need to address the situation in terms of technological development to minimize the rear end crashes for this case.
Cool. No, thank you very much. And by the way, hopefully you can merge one day your two expertises with the geographical analysis of the crashes and autonomous vehicles. So that will be very interesting. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. I think we are finishing, and thank you for answering the questions and your research and participating in the conference. I don't know if there is anything else coming after this one here. And Kinhua, I think